I guess in Bowling Green you say good morning. A Southern Californian says Happy Valentine's Day, I love you. Except for the fact that I don't like what's going on outside. I'm not quite acclimated to it. Hal Cheatham told me this morning that my Southern California identity was known immediately as I walked out with an umbrella. I thought you'd... It's good to be here. I'm really delighted that the College Student Personnel Program, in conjunction with some other components at this university, have taken the time and the interest to focus on a topic that is really a critical topic. With me down front this morning are some courageous people whom I just met. They are students here, and they are going to assist me to try to make this experience for all of us a very live and very real experience. Because indeed the issue of blacks in higher education today is a very important issue for us to focus on. It is very exciting to me, yet it is very paradoxical that we are addressing this issue and trying to bring a component of generativity to it precisely at a time when the declining enrollment of black students has been surfaced in higher education. That declining enrollment has been steadily happening within the last few years. Certainly it is important to all of us to focus on the issue of generativity for blacks and for all groups. And when we focus on generativity, we are concerned with the forward movement of a group of people or a person. Inasmuch as the forward movement of blacks in higher education is in fact a regressive movement, we must accept from the outset that we are concerned about changing the swing of the pendulum in higher education for blacks. We have an extremely complex task ahead of us as student developmentalists and as educators. The alarming statistics that we have seen have only worsened instead of becoming improved over the last few years. I don't think there is anybody here who would even enter into a debate about the reality of the statistics, because the results are in already. But what I would like to do is just highlight for you what some of those results are so that we have the same kind of contextual base. Since 1976, approximately 34% of the high school graduates have entered universities and colleges. That was indeed low enough, but if that were not reason for concern, in 1979, that enrollment dropped to 30%, and in 1983, that enrollment has dropped to 27%. The 1986 statistics are not in yet, and neither are the 85, but it is very clear that the trend is continuing in higher education. In 1983, for example, there were approximately 500,000 more black students who graduated from high school than in 1976. However, there were 8,000 fewer black students enrolled in colleges than in 1976. The most recent study that has been completed was completed by the Southern Regional Educational Board, and that was released, in fact, in the latter part of 85 and early 86. They are projecting that fewer blacks will be enrolled in college in 1990 than today, unless something changes the trends in higher education. The interesting phenomenon is that the population for blacks has almost doubled. So we can see that with the declining enrollment and the doubling and tripling of a population, that we have a very serious problem ahead of us. There are some other national demographics that are equally as disturbing. The 1980 census reports that 87% of whites between the ages of 25 to 29 have completed high school, as compared to 75% of blacks. Of the white parallel group, 23% were college graduates, while blacks comprised 11.7%. The total number of degrees awarded to blacks did not significantly change in the 70s, and I'm sure that probably comes as a surprise to some of us, because it was in the late 70s and late 60s that blacks' matriculation in higher education increased. That was the post-civil rights era. So the enrollment increased, but the completion rate did not complete. The alarming news about that particular statistic is that the total degrees for black men decreased significantly, whereas the total degrees for black women increased. In 1982, 35.6% of black families had incomes below the poverty level. That was compared with 12% for whites. I'm going to ask that the transparency regarding income be shared at this time. What I've tried to do here is indicate for you the parallel differences among white, black, and Spanish origin populations. And here you will see that this is under 5,000. I know that some of this is covered for you. This is 5,000, and over here is 50,000 and above. There can be no doubt then, according to what you see there, that the population that is experiencing a severe income level problem is the black population. The Spanish population is second to the black population, but the severe peak is over here for the white population, which then moves into the 35,000, 50,000 range. So clearly, there are indications that we have some severe problems in the income of blacks in America. In a society which has such historical complexities associated with blacks' access to education and to other human rights as this country does, causal factors will undoubtedly be very complex. Nonetheless, the situation must be examined microscopically to probe the understandings and solutions. Any efforts, therefore, directed at this problem would be considered laudable efforts. And I would like to commend you, and I would like to commend all of those persons who have put some effort into making this a beginning effort to address the problem. Piece by piece, as we begin to unravel some of these variables, we will see that it is a very complicated matter. I would like to highlight for you those variables which seem to be the significant variables affecting higher education. And now I would like for you to look with me at the third slide. As you will see, the economic factors of blacks clearly indicate that of the 27.9 million blacks in America, there is a suffrage of unemployment at a rate of 15% as compared to 5.9% for whites, have the highest poverty rate, almost 36%, although blacks make up 12% of the U.S. population, have 56 cents to spend for every $1 for white families, depend on single mothers to head. 37% of all black families are in the most severely depressed economic condition for blacks since the Vietnam War ended in 1975. And what I'd like to do now is present the next slide, the last one. The remainder of our time will be devoted to dissecting those variables that are considered to be the very critical variables contributing to the negative impact on education. First of all, I will talk to you about federal student aid cutbacks and changes. Secondly, I will talk to you on cutbacks and support services on campuses. Thirdly, black students, quote, lack of interest due to their disappointment with the job payoffs. Fourth, colleges' efforts to tighten standards, and I will spend considerable time talking about that one. The federal government's affirmative action and civil rights policies. Those variables are variables to which we must devote a lot of attention because they, in fact, determine for us the status of blacks in higher education today. Let me just briefly discuss each one of those. But I also want to share with you that I'm not going to focus only on those variables because if I do, then I would not invite us as higher educators, as student developmentalists, to also dissect our system and our process. So I'm going to add to that discussion of variables institutional impact. And at the end of this discussion, then, we will devote a considerable amount of time to institutional impact. But first, let's consider financial aid. Consistently, when the barriers to college access are cited, financial aid is a primary cause for the declining enrollment of blacks. Unquestionably, national policy on financial aid has drastically reduced access for blacks and for the poor. At stake is the fundamental issue of the role of leadership of this country and of the country at large in educating its economically underprivileged class. And I suggest to you that what we really are addressing is the moral fiber of our country when we talk about educating an underprivileged economic class. I submit that not only are we talking about educating blacks, but we are talking about educating all people who are economically underprivileged. And we have to really accept the fact, although it is a dismal one, that the issue before us today is an issue of politics. My colleagues, the education of blacks is a political issue. And let there be no doubt about that. Traditionally, blacks and Hispanics have used more financial aid than whites. That is no longer true. Today, the difference in the usage of financial aid has shifted significantly. The most recent studies that have been released note that white students met 13.3% more of their cost in 1983 using financial aid. That is compared with 6.4% more of the cost for black students. The cost of an average college education today, 1986, is $4,587 a year. That includes room, tuition, board. And that is 7% more than it was a year ago. You can double that for any private institution. It is interesting that the cost of college last year increased with a variation of as high as 57% and as low as 5%. Clearly, the cost of education has increased in the past and will continue to increase. Aston, as you are probably aware, conducts a number of longitudinal studies. In his 1982 study, he stated very clearly that our results show that the lower the family income, the poorer a minority student's prospects in higher education. Further, among blacks, for example, parental income is positively related to undergraduate GPA, undergraduate persistence, and undergraduate satisfaction. Lower income families, among whom are a disproportionate share of minority students, lost resources in the form of family income and in financial aid dollars. The odds of sending children to college increased for higher income families and decreased for lower income families. Access to money, whether earned in the family, whether borrowed or received in grants, is a dominant factor today and will always be a dominant factor in determining who has access to education. The economic status of blacks is a political factor. I said to you that education is a political factor. The economic status of blacks is also a political factor. The persons who are always impacted negatively on economics are the poor, of which blacks are disproportionately represented. Exceptions have been made when there has been national leadership, such as during the Civil Rights era, that focused on advancement and opportunities for the poor. Let there be no doubt that there are definitely causal interactive factors among several variables for any person who matriculates in college. The provision of resources to attend is one factor. Students' aspirations is another factor. National political support and universities' willingness to customize programs to benefit the various populations. I think it's really appropriate that we microscopically examine some of these issues, because what is happening is that indeed the 20th century has already ushered in a problem, a very serious problem, with the possibility for the education of blacks. And what is happening as we confront the 21st century is that problem becomes even more dismal. All you have to do is focus on the profile even of early education. The profile in early education and in higher education is a profile that represents a return to vocationalism for blacks and a lack of preparation for the post-technological era. That is going to be more problematic in the future than it is today. It's always interesting to me that we educators like to believe that we don't have to really engage in the art of politics, when in fact we are a part of politics. We are so political on our campuses, and often we are unable to acknowledge the level of politics that are involved on our campuses. So first of all, we are skilled in politics, but we hesitate to use those skills for some reason when it comes to legislative lobbying. And clearly, legislative lobbying is happening in a way that impacts on education, and that is impacting very negatively on the possibility for education of blacks. The current situation is such that blacks will continue to decline in enrollment because of the declining access to money. And if the new legislation is passed regarding new procedures and financial aid, it is going to worsen. For example, we need to be aware of the fact that there is now impetus for something that is called block financial aid grants. With the forthcoming block financial aid grants, what will happen is that cities and states will receive blocks of money, and again, minorities will be battling each other for that money, and we will not have the kind of need-based perspective that is there. We must then be lobbyists for a need-based perspective in financial aid. Now let me just refer briefly to the cutbacks in support services. Support services on campuses, as we know, were an outgrowth mainly of the civil rights movement. The late 50s, the bloodshed of the 60s, and some of the early 70s. The essence of support services was a design to bring students to campuses, black and white campuses, and provide the appropriate support to enable them to succeed as scholars and as individuals. And universities did not hesitate to compete for those funds. The federal government, as you were aware, and states, had requested that universities that competed for those funds would also provide for continuing opportunities for students once those funds had been discontinued. That did not happen in most cases. So what we have today is that programs have been either discontinued or significantly diluted. Diluted support programs on campus, flying in the face of the financial aid crisis for black students, understandably contributed to the declining enrollment of blacks. So paradoxically, at the moment that we are talking about addressing the issue of the disappearance of blacks in higher education, the support services are not adequately there. Again, I want to come back and underscore that I consider it our moral and ethical obligation to be concerned about the education of all people. It is not just a political issue. It is definitely a moral and ethical obligation. Let me share with you a story of a person that I just spent some time with this year. This is a student whom I will call Adeline, who came to a campus, and I will say a campus because I have been surveying and interviewing students across the country on different campuses. But Adeline came to this campus. She was the first in her family, so she was breaking with family tradition in order to grace and embrace the halls of higher education. Her family had lots of hope for her, and all of her friends back in the community had lots of hope for her. She was bright, and she knew that she was committed and really wanted to set a new family trend. Well, wouldn't you know, the first thing that happened when she walked into her room was that she greeted her roommate. And her roommate, whose name was Cindy, looked up with surprise and sort of stuttered through and said, hello. Her roommate had not been prepared for the fact that there was random roommate assignments. And so in walked this black student, and Cindy, her roommate, was a white student. They made small talk and tried to adjust to the awkwardness that both of them experienced in this situation. But they never really had time together. Adeline, you see, was a very shy person. She had come from a small rural area. She was unable to make connections as she wanted to make connections. And she had a roommate, Cindy, who was a very popular roommate. She was involved in all of the pre-orientation sessions and rush and that kind of thing. So Adeline spent a lot of time in her room alone. The RAs, understandably, did all of the good RA activities. They became aware of the fact that she was lonely, isolated, and alone, and they extended themselves to her. But that kind of extension is not enough. That's good, but it was structured extension of the self, and of course she knew that. About the third or fourth week of school, Cindy, her roommate, walked in and said to her, you know, I've met all these new friends, and I've got a friend who has asked me to room in with her. Now, I hope you understand that there's no problem except that I've just got this good friend that I want to room with, and so I'm going to see if I can get permission to do that. Again, that only isolated Adeline even further, because she did, in fact, move out. Ultimately, what happened to this young woman was that she was unable to bear the loneliness and the isolation. Her hopes and her expectations had been elevated significantly. But she decided that the thing for her to do then was to return to her comfortable community. And her community was disappointed, as was she, but she could not make that adjustment at that point. The federal government's affirmative action and civil rights policies. Most institutions with whom I had some representative involvement have the most well-defined, clearly greased mechanisms for affirmative action. They're beautiful. You would think that they were dissertations that somebody has written. They're absolutely immaculate. The purpose that they have served in the past has been the purpose for protecting universities against federal and state and local audits. As long as that mechanism is in place, and as long as you've got an affirmative action director who knows how to verbalize the right responses, then the auditors generally listen and they're not held accountable. But if that were not bad enough, what has happened again is that there is a shift in the national policy. I was very intrigued by a report that was just recently released by the National Urban League. It's called The State of Blacks in America. And interestingly, the report was released immediately following Martin Luther King's first national holiday. Jacob, who is the author of this report, joined many other Black Americans who could not understand why the president made such noticeable effort to be with Coretta Scott King during the unveiling. And he made the statement that for the president to associate Martin Luther King's effort with affirmative action and the current implementation is absolutely obscene, because the evidence is very, very clear. We've just looked at some of those statistics about employment, poverty, the amount of money that is available. But not only have we seen a decline in the 64-65 legislation and the 54 Supreme Court decision ruling segregation unlawful, there was the 1978 Bakke case, which, according to many persons who are interested in affirmative action, provided license for universities and other agencies to act as if affirmative action were not an issue. It is believed that there is a tendency on the part of universities to assume either that the job is done, that it will not have to be attended to in the future, or to assume that nobody is noticing anymore. I'm not sure which it is. People are noticing. Samuel Proctor made a statement that I think is really a very potent statement about how we must relate to the affirmative action crisis. If you want to beef up the numbers of Black on your campus, you cannot wait for the normal process of evolution, not of social evolution, because it's going in the wrong direction. You've got to intervene and turn that spiral the other way, because that spiral has been given momentum to move in the opposite direction. Let's talk about the college's effort to tighten standards. That's another one around which I have a lot of commitment and emotional responses. It is increasingly apparent that the declining pattern of college matriculation is more a push-out than it is a dropout. We've talked about cutbacks in federal aid, reduced support services, and a reversal of affirmative action. And now let's juxtapose with that the new Get Tough policies in higher education. These so-called Get Tough policies have denied access to Blacks. I was really intrigued with the fact that there will be a presenter in this series who will address the new NCAA issue. I would be very interested to get some response from that. I want to be understood clearly. I really want you to know that I believe in quality education. I wouldn't spend as much time in it if I did not believe in it. So I'm a strong advocate for that. But I'm not an advocate for what's happening now in higher education. again, coming back to Aston and his 1982 study, he really warned us that the meritocratic criteria frequently found in the state master plans, a criteria that link institutions and programs' quality with student attributes, and the outcomes are reduced access for blacks. Excellence, my colleagues, has become the new code for discrimination and inequity. And interestingly, it is happening at a time when the president of the College Board has indicated to us that there are major inclines in the progress of black students on standardized tests. The information that test scores for all students are declining then is simply not true. The National Association of Educational Progress reports that black students at the ages of 9, 13, and 7 showed steady, consistent improvement between 1970 and 1980 in reading. These are the college-age students of today. Mathematics scores for blacks improved at age 9, but declined for the population in general. At age 13, black students' mathematics scores stabilized while the general population experienced a decline. And age 17, black students experienced a test score decline exactly comparable to the white population. So the previously feared gap in test scores has narrowed. It has in fact reduced by 13% on verbal tests and 18% on mathematical tests. Now, I ask you, given that kind of reality, what sense does the new Get Tough policy make? If, in fact, when a people can have exposure to education, it has a positive impact, what are we doing? I really don't understand what we're doing. Now I'd like to just take a minute to speak about black students' demotivation, or the so-called lack of support. Beleaguered black Americans whose expectations have been raised have responded, I think, with despair. Cut off by benign neglect, by universities, by the absence of national policy to maintain the momentum, and by the lack of societal commitment to guarantee equality, young blacks have begun to retreat. We can't deny that black people, by their behavior, have indicated to us that they really want access to higher education, that they really want quality education. Every black student that I asked that question indicated that education was important and they wanted access. I even came across a young man who had dropped out from a prestigious Ivy League university. He was waiting tables. And I asked him what happened. He was so articulate. He was one of the most articulate waiters that I have ever seen. Obviously a mismatch in what he was doing. I said, what happened? He said, well, the university initially lured me in with a wonderful financial aid package, and I couldn't sustain it, so I had to stop. Again, he said, I'm going back. He said, yes, I know, it's true, the support programs were not there, but I went prepared. I knew that I would not have the kind of social support and social interaction that I wanted, but I was prepared for that reality. All I wanted to do was to get out. But even I could not stay in because I didn't have the money to do that. And that's not unusual. We elevated the expectation of many, many students and did not deliver in a constructive way. I think one of the things that happened in that elevation of expectations is that we also anticipated that something would happen with the peer generation of black students that would affect a change in attitude and a change in values with their peers. Interestingly, what Aston's 1985 survey has indicated is that that did not take place. asked and interviewed some 182,000 students across the country. And he asked them to prioritize on those values that are the most important values for them. The first, as you might guess, and this doesn't surprise me, is to become an authority in the field. I think all of us would like to gain that kind of expertise, so that's fine. The second is something that began to surface last year in the name of yuppieism, and I guess, did you know black people started using buppieism too? So yuppieism and buppieism took over. The second most important value identified by the majority of these 182,000 students in 1985 was being financially well off. Now, that's number 2. You have any idea where racial harmony would fit in a hierarchy of 11, 1 to 11? At the bottom. Their peers consider racial harmony to be number 11 in their priorities. Now, this is happening at a time when someone decided to conduct a study of student leaders to determine really what is this about that students are saying that racial harmony is at the bottom. Student leaders were asked to determine what the priorities are on their campus today, this fall. The student leaders, first of all, indicated that if they were to describe their campuses, the most pervasive existing philosophy or attitude is that of apathy. College students today seem to be projecting a rather apathetic response. On the few campuses then where there was activism, the dominant theme that was identified was the South African issue. Now, I want to applaud students because, as I indicated to you in the past, I don't know anything that is uglier than the human condition that exists in South Africa. So I applaud that effort. But of students in this country, only 1 or 2 identified racial issues, the Civil Rights Restoration Act, as something that would be of concern in this country. Now, one interpretation of that, an interpretation which I have challenged people to look at for some time, is the interpretation of projection. It's very interesting to me that when Alvin Poussat was asked to give a response regarding the condition of black students on campuses today, he suggested that we really need to take time to examine the American style apartheid. Because in fact, whereas we do not have legalized apartheid, as does South Africa, we need to examine whether or not it exists on some informal levels. Can we, for example, as educators and student developmentalists, assist the student peers, the non-black students, to examine the analogy of projection and apartheid, and to look at some of the institutional issues that must be recognized in order to make it possible for students to adjust on their campuses at home? I think we can. In the fall, when I was asked to accept this assignment, I think it probably was in October, and my great ambition was to be able to come to you with some very current information, some information that would be anecdotal in nature. And so to the extent possible, I have collected a lot of information which will later be formalized in the form of a research report. But what I'd like to do is call attention to some of the findings in that report, because I think if we look at evidence that came out of that particular piece of research, And we consider the evidence that has surfaced also in the research of Jacqueline Fleming, blacks in colleges today. And actually, I also decided to go back to my dissertation, which seems to be the first piece of research that was conducted in this area. What I decided to do in 1969, with the wonderful support of some of my colleagues, was examine the adjustment reactions of students on black campuses as compared to students on white campuses. And what I discovered is what we are rediscovering over and over today, and that is that black students are having some difficulty with the building and maintenance of self-concept issues of belongingness when it comes to making adjustment on white campuses. And all we have to do is reflect on our student development theory, on the works of people like Perry and Levenger. And we know that social, interpersonal adjustment, social and interpersonal support are critical factors to intellectual development. It is because of that critical factor that students are not as happy on white campuses as they would like to be. And so I know now that I'm going to ask my stage companions to shift a lot in the interest of time. But what has happened in my research on black students on white campuses is that I decided that I wanted to ask them a series of questions. They were open-ended questions that would address their perceptions of the environments that they are experiencing. They were questions like, why did you choose this university? What do you like most about this university? What do you like least about this university? To what do you attribute your status of success or failure at this university? Do you feel socially adjusted and personally happy here? Describe the negative and positive aspects of support programs on your campus. Would you recommend this university to other blacks? Why or why not? What would make this university an ideal place for students? If you have friends who dropped out, what were their stated responses? Describe your faculty interactions. Identify ethnic affiliations of your faculty connection. The trends that emerged were not surprising trends again. First of all, it doesn't matter whether a black student decides to choose a black university or a white university. Their dominant theme was the academic reputation of the university. Now, I know that some people questioned that because of some of the stereotypes and some of the realities that exist around funding possibilities in black universities. Nonetheless, black students choose their universities because they perceive the universities to be reputable. They choose black universities because of the sociocultural component for peer identity formation. Among expressed peer identity issues were recurrent themes of finding dates and finding partners. To a lesser degree, black students choose their universities because of location, financial packages, family trends, especially those students who are matriculating at black universities indicated that the family had matriculated at these universities and they were interested in following that kind of family history. Here is a typical response. I wanted to attend a black university primarily because I was tired of dealing with the subtle racism directed against minorities at white universities. That was characteristic of a number of students' responses. I also asked them why did their friends drop out, in addition to identifying dropouts. Again, the dominant theme that surfaced was that the white university, or this university, was too far away from the life they were used to, especially the environment. The other reasons listed for dropout included those that we have cited: financial aid, lack of motivation, lack of preparation, lack of personal recognition on campus. I then asked students, do black students recommend white universities for blacks? And I'm going to ask the persons who are on stage, and by the way, I just plucked them out of the audience, and they've said to me, don't give me an anxiety attack in doing this. But I asked them to read just some of these comments, and I'm going to ask you to really just skip through, because what I have is a series of comments regarding a number of different questions, and my understanding is that we are to finish in a few minutes. So I'm going to ask you to make some condensed responses, okay?
Do black students recommend white universities for blacks? One student stated, I have mixed feelings. They, students, should be given the factual points. Problems were thrown at me here. For example, one of my professors believed in genetic inferiority in my department. He freaked me out.
Blacks need information about white campuses. Other black students could share their feelings. I would like to share mine with those attending to matriculate here.
At a white university, you get a good academic background, but you are also stifled.
I wanted to go to a black college, but prestigious universities gave me more money.
I think so, but they should know what they are in for. One thing white campuses would do if you are well prepared and get along with them is put their stamp of approval on you. But you must be good, super good.
No, there are not enough student-teacher relationships.
Yes, a predominantly white university could be more well-rounded.
Not until changes are made in the staff and faculty to give the support necessary to make it through this European institution.
Do black students recommend black universities to black students? It is good, and chances of admission are higher.
There's a lot to offer here. I wish there was more enthusiasm and support for the sciences.
It provides opportunities that may otherwise not exist for blacks.
The grading system is based on the highest scoring class, thereby lowering grades and not representing what you have learned.
They play political games here too.
What do you like least about this university? It confounded my black conscience. There's only temporary relationships built here.
That's a white university.
There were too few black faculty. I had no faculty relations, really.
Black faculty on campus have no permanence and no status.
It's hard. There are too few blacks. What do you do? I developed white friends, but there was always a fear of betrayal. It dawned on them that I was black. You always know, or they remind you.
It's cold here. You know the difference. On the outside, you feel you are in, but you're not.
Black students least like qualities about black universities. Many faculty and staff take too long to get things done. Too much red tape.
Lack of black instructors. Whites have taken over. Not enough black PhDs.
Lack of emphasis in sciences.
What do black students like most about white universities? A chance to interact with black faculty and staff and the few who are around you.
Opportunity to take a leadership role on campus.
The support from the black staff, who enjoy dealing with black students who are very few.
What do black students like most about black universities? The friendly, relaxed atmosphere and the fact that there is always someone to talk to that understands you as a poor black student struggling for an education.
Encouragement in the sciences.
The presence of black PhDs doing outstanding research. They give me something to emulate.
The family atmosphere, sense of belonging, challenging programs, and camaraderie among the students and faculty.
To what do you attribute your success at the white university? My background, high school fundamentals helped. I came with confidence.
I was in the transition summer program, and that helped a lot.
Maturity and dedication.
The Black Student Science Organizations is made up of science students. Students are serious about getting things done.
I had the desire, the motivation to be successful. It also helped to see others succeed.
Strong influence of black faculty and staff, encouragement and role models, progressive attitude of black and campus.
The response to the question from black colleges regarding success indicators were brief and consistent. Hard work, motivation, honesty, self-confidence, objectivity from the faculty.
A return to black culture and identifying identity in black universities. Some black students are returning to black universities in 1985 and 86 after matriculating at prestigious white universities. Their comments include, I came here to be with lots of blacks, to get the black perspective.
On this campus, there is a world of difference. Issues are identified which are relevant to me.
Seminars on blacks on campuses are really on target.
I get an added dimension to my education here at the Black University.
At an Ivy League campus, the professors presented the facts, but they glided over the experiences. At this university, they emphasize black issues, and that feels good.
I came here to do black research. Here I am rounding it out. I guess I needed both.
Black students are unable to function outside of their own group.
Support programs which allow me to be natural and not have to assume professional white mannerisms and attitudes.
A living environment or a centralized meeting place for blacks to interact and discuss things. A hangout.
I think they were good, don't you? As you can see, I've got a job laid out for me in trying to pull that together. But I wanted you to hear some of the statements that are coming from students. Tentatively, and I want to make sure you understand that this is a preliminary analysis of research using a thematic approach. It appears that black students are aware that no university, black or white, is sufficiently focused on their preparation for the post-technological era. Black students are wanting more science, more computer technology, and more involvement as members of a future society. Black students perceive the intellectual quality of their education to be comparable in white and black universities, although previous research would demonstrate that a negative interactive effect in white universities exists due to the lack of personal social development. Black students' feelings of social isolation and alienation on white campuses were unanimously highlighted as social adjustment issues that we need to address in student development. Black students' cultural alienation on white campuses is a key factor in their social adjustment. Black students resort to local external community for their socio-cultural connections. And that was something that consistently came out, that black students are now beginning to leave the campus for their social interaction because campuses are not providing for that. Support services, including faculty contact, peer interaction, administrative support, and formalized support programs, are perceived to be minimally helpful in 1985, but in the past they perceived them to have been more helpful. Black students then perceive their educational experiences on black campuses to be well-rounded because of the following variables. Caring faculty interaction, we can certainly have that on any campus. Presence of stabilized, prestigious black role models. They really talked about the numbers issue and the revolving door policy for too many black faculty on black campuses, and the tentativeness of the assignments of black faculty. Black cultural enrichment programs and experiences, formal and informal support programs, including black faculty accessibility, peer support programs, personal social development opportunities, increased heterosocial interaction. Let me just try to close out this now by asking us to focus on student development. Those of you who know me and my values will know that I tend to be an optimist. I mean, an eternal optimist. Sometimes my staff says to me, but don't you see this? So, as the eternal optimist that I am, I would tend to view a phenomenon of a glass that is filled to half mark as half full rather than as half empty. And so I'm going to suggest that we as student development people view this glass as half full and make some decisions about where we must go from here. We, I think, already know where we must go because we've got theory-based information to assist us. But there is one issue that I want to call attention to. And I guess this is a challenge for me as well as for you. One thing I am aware of is that we as student developmentalists have not adequately researched the issue of black development. We know a lot about the development of white males. We are beginning to know something about the development of women through such efforts as Gilligan's work. But I don't think we understand the development of black people. And I guess I want to throw that out to a very motivated person who's looking for a dissertation idea. We really need to understand the development of blacks. And that, to me, is a real challenge for us in student development. That also suggests that one of our priorities then in student development must be focused on research. Research that enables us to have a different kind of knowledge base than we have now. I think we also have a knowledge base about program development in student affairs. So we really need to just go back to the basics when it comes to understanding how we can organize programs that will address those issues that students have identified. We know the ecosystems model, outreach programming, planned change strategies, training models, and strategic planning. I think all of those are adequately in place so that we can address this deficit that is beginning to surface in black students' college experience. I think we need to really focus on designing relevant and continuing staff development programs for faculty and staff. And I want to underscore continuing programs for for faculty and staff. We need to apprise them of what is happening to black students and their adjustments and what we need to do to address that. We need to build change strategies on our campuses that provide purposeful faculty interaction. I couldn't believe how much that leaped out as a dominant theme. Students want to be connected with adults. And it's true that black students are saying, I want to be connected with black adults, but they also are saying, I want to be connected with non-black adults. So if we could build those kinds of strategies in our programming, I'm convinced that it would make a difference. I also suggest that we need to influence industry, business, and government to provide the kind of special support and mentoring and job placement opportunities for black students. Given the information that College Boards has so comprehensively researched, let's go back and re-examine our admissions standards. We know that all of the research in the history of education clearly indicates that there is very little, if any, correlation between College Boards admission scores, national scores, and admission of black students. That GPAs are, in fact, the most effective indicator of admission and success for black students. Student development training programs, such as this training program, must have cross-cultural components that are continual, because in fact the student developmentalists of the future are the people who will address this issue. We need to find ways to affirm black students and black culture by building in components in the program that relate to self-esteem and that relate to building self and self-identity for black students. And finally, I would suggest that there would be wonderful opportunities for learning and designing purposeful exchange programs between white universities and black universities that would also allow students to have exchange experiences and allow staff and faculty to have some exchange experiences. Clearly, there is something that black campuses must have learned that could also be shared with non-black campuses. I want to close by returning to the issue of generativity, because that is indeed where we started out this morning. There have been several blacks and non-blacks who have offered generative ideas for black students. Martin Luther King was one of them. There's a woman who really says it succinctly, and I want to leave her message with you because I think it is a legacy that many of us can begin to integrate and understand when it comes to the needs of black students. The first legacy that she offers us to leave is a legacy of love. Love builds. It is positive and helpful. I would suggest that we leave a legacy of concern, compassion, and love for black students. She also says, I leave you hope. Hope that growth will come and continue in the years. That life, in fact, can be made generative for blacks. I leave you the challenge of developing confidence in one another. The challenge of knowing how to assist black people to build self-esteem for blacks and to make linking confidences with other blacks. I leave you the thirst of education. Knowledge is the prime need of the hour. And when you think of the thirst of education and you think of the current status, you can understand why I am so concerned about the dilemma. Let's try to nurture that thirst, to reignite the thirst. I leave you a respect for the uses of power. You will be the power of student development. Use that power respectfully and understand the meaning of that power when it comes to preparing for all humans' development. I leave you faith. Faith is the first factor in a life devoted to service. I leave you a desire to live harmoniously with your fellow men and women. There is a worldwide concern with color issues. Color does not mean that we promote disharmony. In fact, color means that we promote diversity, that we respect and honor diversity. I leave you finally a responsibility to our young people. The world around us really belongs to youth, for youth will take over its future management. Let us join with the spokesperson who just left that legacy in 1955. Those are the words of Mary McLeod Bethune, and I would like to leave you the same kind of legacy for black students in the future. Thank you.
I'm sure those of you who were here this morning appreciated the presentation on Blacks in Higher Education, 2 Decades Under Scrutiny by Dr. Marveline Stiles Hughes. This afternoon the format is going to be a little less formal, and hopefully you will have some opportunities to interact with our panel of reactors and with Dr. Hughes herself. Our first reactor is Harold Cheatham, who's sitting here with the red tie for Valentine's Day. Dr. Cheatham graduated from the Pennsylvania State University with a BS in psychology, a master's degree from Colgate University, and a doctorate from Case Western Reserve, so he runs in the big leagues too. He has taught many subjects, notably African and Asian culture, and he's taught those at the secondary school level. He's had the opportunity to study on an international level. At one time he studied in the summer of 1967 in India. And he was the educational leader of a study tour entitled Cross-Cultural Counseling in the Soviet Union in 1984. He has been director of university counseling at Case Western Reserve. He has been a professor of psychology at the United States Coast Guard Academy, and he's currently at Penn State University as associate professor of education in the Division of Counseling and Educational Psychology. He has many credentials. He's well lettered, and he has served on many boards. His focused research and writing have to do with Black Americans, higher education, American higher education on cross-cultural counseling, ethnic and cultural minorities. He's published research and writings. His published research and writings address these issues. And he's currently preparing a book on cross-cultural counseling and co-editing a book entitled, tentatively, Black Families, Contemporary Issues and Concerns. It's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Cheatham, and he will react to this morning's presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and to my distinguished colleagues on the dais and those of you in the audience, I appreciate the invitation to come here, especially on this lovely February day. I take that we all here are students, but especially for those of us who are degree seeking, I hope to offer a different experience this afternoon than I'm usually informed of by my students to these. You are invited and will graciously attend symposia. they usually come back with statements of frustration and confusion that the experts sat and tried to out-argue each other, and they don't understand sometimes what it's all about. The different experience that I hope to offer today is that I have no arguments with the presentation which Dr. Hughes made this morning. Rather, my response is a co-signature and nothing beyond an attempt to amplify several of the points which she made, assisted so ably by the courageous black men and women who attend Bowling Green State University and who consented to serve on the program. I will attempt to focus the university environment, the politics and reality, the black student on the white campus, and particularly with reference to Dr. Hughes' notions about causal and interactive factors of black students on white campuses. And ultimately, I want to suggest how we can address the bad news. I entered higher education as a professional, as an administrator in the late 60s when the university was under attack, as reflected in titles of literature of that period: the uses of the university, the embattled university, the student in higher education, and the university in transition, just to name a couple of those. The latter of those two I want to use to provide a focus of my endorsement of Dr. Hughes' contention of the failure of American higher education to respond adequately to the needs of the black Americans. Notably, I want to focus on the 1968 report of the Committee on Students in Higher Education, the Hazen Foundation of New Haven, Connecticut. The tome begins with the statement that, quote, "The American university is one of the most important social institutions devised by modern man. It has demonstrated a remarkable ability to maintain a continuity with its own past and at the same time to keep up with our society's rapidly changing needs." I find that statement interesting, even if I can't accept it at this point. It was a statement that was intended primarily to criticize the collegiate lack of fuller concern for the total development of students, and ultimately it petitioned for the assumption of a more conscious responsibility in the development of students on the basis of our notable progress and increased sophistication in the social and behavioral sciences. The petition further was based on the notion that the national conscience is vaguely aware, quote, that something more is possible and must be done in higher education. It wasn't talking about black students, it was talking about American higher education's need to reorganize itself. And it noted as scandalous the significant number of push-outs who they identified as those who are graciously admitted and then presented a take it or leave option. That is, leave or suffer stunted intellectual development. An equally important piece of that time that was widely hailed is James Perkins' University in Transition, a series of lectures given at Princeton University. And these are 1966. I find them interesting to underscore the point that was made and that I am trying to amplify. Perkins provided two examples in the beginning of those lectures in which he cited the failures of the British and German universities because they had overemphasized one or the other of the three critical missions of the university: acquisition, transmission, and application of knowledge. He warned that institutional arrangements and policies which grossly neglect one or the other build a low ceiling for future growth and vitality. He asserted then that the Morrill Act of 1862 joined the three university missions to a new one termed "in the nation's service," and thereby the relationship between the university and the people it served was changed, altered. He contended in that piece that the university vitalized its role by embracing the complementary mission. It is the rest of Perkins's contention, however, which informs our purpose here today. In conservative language of that period, he goes on, I think curiously, to speak about which students do and do not belong in the university. He suggested that the university's internal cohesion and integrity are threatened by admitting students looking for nurturance which faculty are not prepared to provide them. And he didn't say much about, as the Hazen Committee, about the faculty reorganizing themselves for the new task in the nation's service, which makes this piece stand in contrast for me in its internal parts. He proposed that that a student is a student, and that the student's purpose is to learn, not manage, to reflect, not decide, to observe, not coerce, and that that process required detachment. Our purpose as faculty, he suggested, was to carefully select those aspects where student participation can be accepted. The point that I want to make about that widely acclaimed piece is that ultimately Perkins did not describe a university in transition, but one which maintains its continuity with its past by effectively ignoring society's rapidly changing needs and by proscribing the roles and responsibilities of its constituents. I make that charge because increasingly there is empirical evidence to support the pervasive notion that for all of its post-civil rights era adjustments, American higher education has failed to meet the needs of black Americans. In fact, Prestige charged that the education of blacks has never been a priority on America's public agenda. Actually, beyond that, recent accounts, a book to be released this month by Josie Bass, actually suggests that American higher education does not understand the needs of its consumers in general. My response to Dr. Hughes's paper will not focus any further on that general failure of higher education, but will address higher education's inadequate response to particularly to black Americans, to minority Americans, and particularly to black Americans. In that context, let me review briefly the reported plight of black students in traditionally white institutions, and briefly also the status of the traditionally black institution. Consensus generally is that black students in traditionally black institutions show greater personal and intellectual development than do their counterparts in traditionally white institutions. But the fact is that most black students are in traditionally white institutions and facing significant difficulties there. Black students at traditionally black institutions are reportedly less well prepared academically, have lower aptitude as measured on standard instruments, and generally are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, lower income families. Traditionally white institutions enroll 4 out of every 5 black collegians, and those 4 are generally better prepared than are blacks at black institutions, yet the traditionally black institutions award almost half of the baccalaureate degrees received by black Americans. And according to a report by Barretts and Ficklin in 1984, once they are graduated into the labor market, the only thing which distinguishes black graduates from black institutions from those of white institutions is that the latter are significantly in greater debt. Moreover, graduates of professional schools remain overwhelmingly white. Graduate and professional schools remain overwhelmingly white, with traditionally black institutions producing well more than their share of advanced degrees earned by black Americans. The haunting question is, with the massive amount of capital and the scores of programs directed to blacks attending traditionally white institutions over the last decade, how can the record of the white institutions continue to be so unenviable? A partial answer has been addressed in the charge advanced by Prestige, no priority. The notion is that white colleges actually have continued with business as usual after making a few meaningless and essentially superficial accommodations to black students. A report just completed at my institution looked at freshmen in the entering class and underscores the national record. You heard the students this morning recite the feelings and experiences of black students on white campuses, and here is some empirical statement to support that. Blacks report attending fewer meetings, although both black and white students report membership in 3 or 4 organizations. 88% of white students compared to 69% of black students report general satisfaction with their life. White students demonstrably have a larger network as seen in their report of significantly more important others in the university from outside who are racial fellows. Blacks' important others are usually from their own hometown and are not people who are on the campus or in the larger community. 83% of black students' friends are black. 1% of white students' friends are black. Whites report significantly more dependence on others for stressful events, which underscores the note that black students do not go to helping professionals because of their continuing perception of the inadequacy of the response. Whites reported significantly more tangible and overall support in the university community. And most interestingly to me, the black students in this study, these were freshmen, significantly overestimated the percentage of black men and women in the university and in their dormitory. They reported 14% of the university and the dormitory as being black, which informs me something about the narrowness of their experience on the university campus. And the fact of the matter is that there's part of the error is a function of the housing pattern, which has clusters of black students living in one area. University officials have responded to this observation by saying that rather than as a matter of policy, it's a function of the point at which black students who tend to matriculate late come into the university and therefore are grouped into areas. I'm intimating that there is something for us to look at. The point is that white colleges have not incorporated the advice and the information that is easily available to them. In 1971, at the fever pitch of the integration efforts in the universities being embattled, the NAACP had a study commission which issued a tract which is known as a tract for the time, College and the Black Student. And one of the critical points that I think that tract makes is that the specific issue for white colleges to address was to not ask only what must be done to qualify black students for being on white campuses, but also to ask the question, how may the campus be qualified to serve the needs of black students? We have some evidence that that question has been asked, but they didn't follow the final piece of advice was that the question needed to be asked repeatedly and always without expectation of a final answer, but indeed with the expectation of a new and better question emerging. The inescapable point is that the desegregated campus would have to undergo fundamental change which did not depend upon initiatives of black Americans. The institution, in short, had to make a commitment to developing and nurturing a bona fide multicultural environment. That has not happened, and the pernicious effects of higher education's efforts at desegregation continue. Johnson in 1954 suggested that the impact of the High Court's ruling, which required desegregation of public schools, goes far beyond the question of the constitutionality of separate but equal. The contention was that the fabric of Black American society had been irreparably rent by the decision. While the Adams ruling does not similarly have the weight of the United States Supreme Court behind it, it has had similar effects on blacks resulting from the efforts at desegregation of higher education. Those of you who are not degree seeking but who are students of this issue will reflect with me to the late 60s and early 70s, the confusion that arose from the clamor about desegregation. At that time, many Americans, both black and white, were hard-pressed to understand the struggle which ensued in many school districts, and notably New York City's Morningside Heights, where residents pledged to resist loss of control of, quote, their school. At issue there and in the current crisis is the effect on blacks resulting from desegregation of both traditionally white and black campuses. Blacks are suffering the secondary effects which are visible in the disruption of the historic institutionalized systems in the black community. From at least the antebellum South onward, the black community existed as a functional system. Blackwell contends, and Blasingame, that despite the that despite the oppressive system of slavery with its designs to destroy vestiges of community, that blacks emerged from that oppressive system with a system of social organization. The church stood as an independent and autonomous conservator and transmitter of morals. Schools operating as autonomous and semi-autonomous units provided social and psychological development of blacks in an unequivocal environment. Hill points out that blacks' attendance at traditionally white institutions was seen as progress by the informed, but to the knowledgeable it was known as retrogression, because ultimately the effect was to undermine the quality of blacks' educational environment, to wit, what we have now. Black schools previously had served also as instruments through which black educators could discharge their responsibility to the black community. In these schools, the identity of the black educator and the student were enhanced rather than mediated. How then should American higher education proceed to undo its version of apartheid, which was referred to this morning? Institutional managers who, in the words of the NAACP tract, showed black students the dungeon door and gave them wall-to-wall freedom there, need to undertake a reevaluation of its efforts at desegregation. Berrien contends that programmatic enhancement of historically black institutions is the most critical of things which need attending to if these institutions are to survive and to be of service to the total society. I believe an unarguable point there. In contrast to the notions of Fleming, Berrien states categorically, and this is a quote, "It is not true that historically black institutions are better equipped to provide developmental services or that they are more prone to do so." Close quote. He goes on to note that a careful examination of 100 programs in states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and in the District of Columbia found no indication that traditionally white institutions, and here are the critical words, two of them, once committed to the concept of developmental education, are less adept at providing a successful program. In fact, Berrien contends that there's evidence to the contrary, that traditionally white institutions are proudly and increasingly engaged in developmental education with the fringe benefit of designing and planning and research options accruing to their faculty. I think that the words in the NAACP tract are no less vital today than they were in 1971 when they were enunciated. There were 25 points made there, actually 26, but the 26th was that I have read and understand the above 25, and I am committed to working to make sure that other people read this. I will pass the track on, and I will roll up my sleeves and get to business. Those 25 statements address the existence and continuous examination of policies and procedures supported by strategies for implementation. They also address active and committed recruitment of students to create a multicultural student body, making available support services and curricula, which draw positively on multicultural experiences. Further, open access to facilities, to all facilities and organizations on the campus, and local and institutional, creating understanding and support for policies among local and institutional representatives. And finally, they proposed an orientation of new arrivals to the campus that they may understand the prevailing customs and commitment of the university. I think that we have seen rather clearly that not much of that has happened, and at least it has not happened in any systematic and continuous way. The prevailing anti-climate in the country has served to underscore the plight of Black Americans on these campuses. I see in my institution and in other institutions which I visit. I read the Bowling Green News or the BG News yesterday, and every campus that I go on, I receive and study from cover to cover the same way the student newspaper, and I get confirmation of the perception that we have only haphazardly made efforts in the direction of undertaking the dismantling of apartheid in the university system. We've done superficial things, and as retrenchment comes our commitment to creating a genuine multicultural environment, and in other words, barring the dungeon door, has indeed not happened. There is conclusive evidence that basic skills assessment programs, that basic skills programs and other factors which tend not to be evaluated in looking at students' adjustments to campus provide other dimensions that assist them in making legible the university environment, and that more effort needs to be undertaken. I will, in the interest of time, not enumerate for you from the literature, but there's a series of articles that have appeared in the professional literature in our field which suggests, and interestingly enough, none of them is new. They're all, in fact, quite old, but there is evidence to support that, as Berrien pointed out, once committed to the task, those universities that intend indeed to change the complexion of the university environment and the interaction for those within it indeed have been successful. I thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to respond to questions of what I think is an affirmation of the point was so ably made by my distinguished colleague.
Thank you very much. Before we continue with the next speaker, I would like to give you a little bit of history that I learned at lunch today. I discovered that Dr. Harper, our next reactor, and Dr. Hughes and Dr. Stone, our own Win Stone, were the first three Black doctoral recipients from Florida State University in counseling psychology. I thought that was very interesting. Excuse me. Frederic Harper received his Bachelor of Science degree from Edward Waters College in Florida in the social sciences, and his Master's of Education from Florida A&M in guidance and counseling, and his PhD from Florida State University in counseling education. He did a postdoctoral program at George Mason State University of Virginia and HEW, National Institute on Alcohol Abuse. He has been the chairman and professor of Howard University Counseling and Counseling Psychology and Student Development Programs. And he's also had the opportunity to teach the College of the Virgin Islands and the University of DC. He also has a notable track record of which he should be proud. He is a member of several psychological organizations and the Association of Running Psychologists. He serves on, he can explain that. He has had service on several editorial boards, the Journal of Counseling and Development, and his research and writing interests are counseling, theory, construction, and he's lectured and consulted in many states. He has presentations, one entitled Counseling as a Tool to Help Lifestyle Modification, Particularly Alcoholism, Psychopoetry, the Use of Poems and Verse in Counseling, and he has a publication, 48 cited, including poetry. And he's evaluated programs of the governmental agencies and universities. He has a few hobbies: jogging, poetry, microcomputers, and common stocks, and I hope he's very successful there. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Frederic Harper.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Edmonds, and greetings from Howard University and myself to all of you. It's good to be back to Bowling Green. Sort of feel like this is a home, and it's good to be here with colleagues, especially Dr. Hughes, a former classmate and a good colleague whom I've always held the highest respect. I was asked to explain the jogging. I'll do that briefly. I'm very proud of 14 years. This is my 14th anniversary of year-round jogging, more than 20,000 miles in more than 100 cities. So that explains the jogging, which I did not anticipate to come out, but since it came out, you hear that explanation. First, I will give a brief formal statement based on notes on Dr. Hughes's talk prior to her presentation. Secondly, I will informally comment on her presentation this morning. The question of the 1980s is a question that will be apparently one that will persist into the 1990s. It is a question that will be illuminated even more intensely as time lapses. It is a question that troubles a few, however, one that is oblivious, if not unimportant, to those whom it does not concern. It is a question that is increasingly affecting working and middle-class whites, but more than ever, it impinges upon the great majority of black Americans. It is simply the question of what to do with people. That is, what to do with the welfare of mothers without job skills or child care, what to do with the homeless without a home or who can't go back home, not only adults, but runaway youth, what to do with farmers without a farm, what to do with the unemployed without a job, what to do with unmarried pregnant teenagers who face the world many times alone, and what to do with the talented student without college tuition. In the last 10 to 20 years, we have witnessed and/or experienced a social reformation driven by the advent of the microcomputer, the great advancements in robotics and cybernetics, quantum leaps in communication and transportation, drastic changes in career opportunities, an increase in divorce rate, a decrease in childbirth, economic extremes in the 1970s, and increases in social problems. For example, family disruption, illicit drug use, homicide, and suicide. This social transformation has displaced many well-intentioned Americans. However, has had its gravest impact on the major American ethnicities of color. I agree with Dr. Hughes that although a few blacks have made gains during the last 20 years, the great majority have been set back or stand no better than they stood in 1965, both in society and higher education. For example, number one, we cannot overlook the recent statistic that black female-headed families have doubled since 1965 to the current 50% level, and that is of this day, 1986 estimates. Two, we cannot overlook the estimation that approximately 60% of today's black children will experience family disruption due to divorce, separation, or death of a parent. Three, we cannot overlook the black male's vulnerability to homicide, prison, drug abuse, alcohol problems, unemployment, poor health, undereducation, and low expected lifespan, circumstances with implications for the black family, and surely circumstances that are not due to the black male alone. The black male has for years had difficulty in adjustment in American society, and a number of black outstanding men have left, including James Baldwin, W.E.B. Du Bois, Richard Wright. There's a mystery about the adjustment of black men in America. Four, we cannot overlook the data that the median black family income is still only 55 to 57% of that reported for white families. No significant improvement from 1965. Five, we cannot overlook the fact that it now costs more than $100,000 to raise a child through college. Nevertheless, recent census data show that approximately 50% of black children are living in poverty compared to only 17% of white children. Six, we cannot afford to overlook the condition of more than 70% of black youth who grow up in urban areas, some with hope for college but battling the negative social forces of illicit drugs, crime, and sexual pressures. And there are a couple of studies now indicating that black children look at TV for some 8+ hours a day due to limited entertainment and recreation and due to the dangers on the streets. And some communities tell time by looking at TV in terms of what programs come on. This is also a study, a finding that was reflected in a study in Washington, D.C. People tell time in some urban areas by television. And they are influenced by the models on TV as well as the advertisements. Seven, Dr. Hughes noted we cannot overlook declines in many areas of black representation in higher education, including black enrollment in medical schools, college enrollment in general, and enrollments in professional and graduate schools. We might also be reminded that black college students continue to be overrepresented in the study of education, and this is very important, overrepresented in the study of education, the humanities, and the social sciences, and underrepresented in law, medicine, health professions, banking, applied mathematics and computer sciences, engineering, and the natural sciences, among a few other areas. Those ethnic groups and countries that have power in economics and control in politics and the economics of the world are those, if you watch education, whose students major in those power disciplines of engineering, banking, marketing, the skills in human survival. Blacks tend to study education, humanities, and the social sciences, and this has been a historical orientation and surely an implication for student personnel and counseling in terms of our role. Although there's been an increase in the proportion of black high school graduates, black youth are evidently being misguided and misplaced. That is, too many are being counseled or assigned to special education and vocational education, and too few into college preparatory tracks. Is this the result of indifference, misconception, incompetence, negligence, or racial discrimination? I raise this question because too many documented cases are appearing in regards to black youth being pushed out of the same term Dr. Hughes used, being pushed out of desegregated schools or gerrymandered to non-college tracks just because they are black and or culturally intolerable. I give you 3 or 4 examples. One black woman wanted counseling on becoming a medical doctor. She was advised, you are not smart enough, so therefore you should seek to be a teacher. She followed that advice and she became a teacher in Washington, D.C. She was not satisfied with that career attainment, and she finally applied to medical school at Georgetown University. That black woman became the valedictorian of the med school in her graduating class. This is not an isolated case. Malcolm X reported a case in his autobiography of being advised to be a carpenter when he expressed wanting to be a lawyer. A second case, and this is happening too often in school situations, a black teenager was placed in vocational education, and his mother found him doing work on automobiles, body and fender work. But there's nothing wrong with that, except this black kid was a genius with an IQ of 148 to 50. His mother had to come up to the school and confront counselors and the principal to have that child reassigned to college prep. A number of black boys are being placed in special education, not because they are disabled mentally or physically or in need of these types of services in education, but because they were persistent conduct problems and a pain to teachers. And fourth, based on my own experience as a counselor in a community college, a student came to me, a black student, and said, my English teacher refuses to read my paper because she does not believe that a black student can write a paper that is that good. You know, Gunnar Myrdal once said, the problem of race relations in America is a problem that is in the minds of many white Americans, and maybe things have not changed too much. And that doesn't mean that it's also in the minds of many black Americans who react to certain cues in terms of suspicion and other types of reactions. But some of these problems reflect persons relating to images and not individuals. I guess you're asking, why won't he mention these success stories of blacks in higher education? Yes, I agree. There are the competent and concerned counselors, student development workers, and administrators. Yes, there are helpful and dedicated black and white professionals. Yes, there are supportive programs that have been of great assistance to black youth. Some good ones right here at Bowling Green State University, I understand. Yes, there are black students who achieve on their own strengths and that of their families. However, the statistics show there is evidently too little effect or not enough effort across the board to make a national difference for the last 20 years. In talking about these statistics, in part, I have reference to data from the Center for Educational Statistics, 1986-87 projections, the College Entrance Examination Board's recent report, Equality of Excellence, the Educational Status of Black Americans, the Chronicle of Higher Education, a recent issue, 1986, about the enrollment of black students, freshman enrollment, the ETS Developments periodical that comes out, and the earlier mentioned Jackie Fleming's Blacks in College. Let us never forget that the crises and limitations of black Americans are rooted in the social matrix of the Atlantic slave trade. I think we often forget that occurred in the West, as well as legal segregation and discrimination that persisted to the mid-1960s, just a generation ago, in many of our memories. It is now time that racially motivated policies and practices cease. Multicultural education at the school and college levels must become a required reality for all students, faculty, and staff. Black professionals must take tougher, more dedicated, and more energetic efforts in the development of black youth. We cannot blame whites for our problems. We have to work harder in joint effort to eliminate some of these conditions. Higher education must make a commitment to the education of black talent. It has not made this commitment. And on that same note, higher education, especially predominantly white universities and many attitudes therein, have to remove the attitude that things done with and for black students is a gift. There are public universities as well as private universities that persons have access to and should be served. And as I've done research, sometimes I see the attitude that things done in relationship to black students is sort of an extra, and these are not students who are subject to the same services.